All right, we're ready for Daniel 7 and 8. Daniel 7 and 8 for our study this morning. And we'll get underway with looking at our summary of what the book is about, because I want to remind you of that principle time and again. Even though that phrase may not be used always, that principle is being repeated, and we see it even in our chapters today, that God rules in the kingdoms of men. So that theme is just being driven home time and again. Now, it was stated specifically in chapter 4 and in chapter 5, and that phrase is no longer used, that I recall, in the rest of the book. But the principle is there, and we're going to see that even at the opening of, we won't get 3 verses into the book, and we've already seen God rules in the kingdoms of men. This upheaval of the sea, we'll see that in that concept here in just a moment. But I keep reminding you of that, and let's keep marking that and noting that. Here is our outline of the book. This is important because this helps us keep perspective of where we are. The arrangement of the book is not chronological. And you already know that if you've kept up, that it's not chronological. In other words, the events of chapter 7 do not follow in sequence to chapter 6. It backs up a little bit. So what we have in the book is the history section, the vision section. We're starting the vision section. But in each of those sections, he divides the material by the Babylonian period and the Persian period. And so as he goes into the second section concerning the visions, he's going back to the Babylonian period, backing up just a little bit. In fact, it's going prior to even the events of chapter 5. You remember chapter 5 of the Babylonian period dealt with the reign of Belshazzar, the end of Belshazzar's reign. Well, we're backing up just a little bit earlier than that. So not only are we backing up from chapter 6, we're backing up even into earlier than chapter 5 in time. And we'll get to what that time period here is in just a moment. So under the vision section, we have under the Babylonian rule. That's where we are today. We're looking at 2 visions. There's the vision of the 4 beasts, and then there's the vision of the ram and the he-goat. And that's the 2 visions that we're talking about. Now, next week, if you think this week is difficult, this week is a piece of cake compared to the Daniel 70 weeks. And so we'll get into Daniel 70 weeks. It's not all that difficult. It's just a little more difficult than these 2 visions of our study today. Let's talk about apocalyptic literature. It's been a little while since we've done that. There are certain sections of the Bible that are written in language that we call apocalyptic literature. What is the nature of apocalyptic literature? There are books like Revelation, obviously is apocalyptic, parts of Daniel, chapter 7 on, parts of Ezekiel, Zechariah. So what's involved in apocalyptic literature? Well, these 4 principles are usually involved in apocalyptic literature. There is imagery, such as we have in chapter 7, that are visions. So it's written in symbolic language. Various reasons for that. We're more interested in that when we get, for example, to the book of Revelation than I am at this juncture. But apocalyptic literature has imagery and visions. Now, let's talk about the imagery first. The imagery, there's going to be things like we're seeing in the vision. Here's the image of a goat. Here's a he-goat. There is the ram. There is the 3 beasts that are mentioned and one unidentified beast. And they stand for something. Well, they're identified for us here in 7 and 8. They're not always identified in apocalyptic literature. Visions. I made this point last time, and we need to keep making that point. In apocalyptic literature and in a vision, anything is possible. And my classic illustration is that of Ezekiel's will within a will. Ezekiel talks about a will within a will that can go in all directions. Well, if you have a will that can roll in this direction, a will inside of that can't also roll in the other. It's impossible. But in a vision, all things are possible. You can do anything in a vision. And so God does that. So we see that in the vision. There is also the predictive element. We see that in our study today, that there is the prediction of the coming kingdoms and the fall of those kingdoms and the coming of the kingdom of Christ. And then there is the dramatic. There is the dramatic effect. So why use this language? Well, when we get to Revelation, we're going to see the purpose is to hide the message so that those who are intended to receive the message get the message, but it's hidden from those who don't really care about the message at all, except they're trying to oppress Christians. But here it seems to be to emphasize the point that God rules in the kingdoms of men, and we'll see that as we go further. So that's some of the characteristics of the apocalyptic literature. So we're ready now for Daniel's vision of the four beasts in chapter 7. So let's talk about what we have in chapter 7. We have two things that happen in this chapter. We have Daniel's dream about the four beasts, and then we have, didn't mean to go there, and then we have the interpretation of the dream. So let's get verses 1 to 3. Then we're going to jump ahead to a key that unlocks this chapter, and then we're going to go back to verses 4 and following. So let's start with Daniel's dream. Daniel has a dream. He saw four beasts coming out of the sea, and he saw the Ancient of Days. And so all of these 14 verses are focusing on the dream without giving the interpretation yet. The interpretation comes a little bit later. But let's start at verse 1. Let's get the date of this. This was in the first year of Belshazzar. This would be 549 BC, if you want to make a note in your margin. This is in the first year of Belshazzar. Now remember, chapter 5 was at the end of Belshazzar's reign, because at the end of chapter 5, Babylonian rule was over. So we're backing up even prior to the events of chapter 5. He had dreams while on his bed, and he wrote these down, and here are the main facts. Now, verse 2 is we need to stop and talk about some things in verse 2. That Daniel saw in a vision, behold, the four winds of the heaven were stirring up the great sea. Now, in biblical literature, particularly apocalyptic literature, but not just apocalyptic literature, there is the idea of a sea representing the mass of humanity. And you say, well, how do you know that's what that's talking about? Well, there's a couple of things. One is, out of this sea comes four creatures. And you say, okay, that doesn't tell me anything yet. But the four creatures represented four kings and four kingdoms. So they came out of something. They came out of the great sea. Well, that would be humanity, or the mass of humanity, or the world population, etc. Let me give you a couple of three passages. Let's go to Isaiah 17 and 12. I'm going to hit these quickly in the interest of time. That woe to the multitude of my people who make noise like the roaring of the sea. Here's a multitude of people, a mass of humanity. They're compared to a sea. Is that 100% proof that that's what's going on in Daniel 7? No. But it does tell me that God sometimes uses the sea to have reference to the mass of humanity. While you're in the book of Isaiah, let's go to the 57th division and look at verse 20. Isaiah 57 and verse 20. But the wicked are like a troubled sea. Here again is the mass of humanity compared to a sea which cannot rest, and the waters cast upon mire and dirt, whose waters cast up mire and dirt. And so again, the mass of humanity is compared to a body of water, the sea. Let's get one more reference along that line. Let's go to the book of Revelation. This is apocalyptic literature. Look at Revelation chapter 17, and let's see, that should be verse 15. That the waters which you saw where the harlot sat are peoples, multitude, nations, and tongues. Well, I know there it's talking about the mass of humanity. So that's what I'm trying to demonstrate is that in apocalyptic literature and in some non-apocalyptic literature, in this biblical literature, I should say, make that a little simpler, sometimes the sea has reference to the mass of humanity. Well, let's go back to verse 2 and talk about the four winds were stirring up the great sea. That seems to have, as Homer Haley suggests, that it's an upheaval that results in various kingdoms and various governments. So the winds were blowing. Well, let me give you another couple of examples where that kind of concept is used. Let's go to Jeremiah. I'm just trying to justify the interpretation, give some evidence for that. This is part, if you're paying attention to our Wednesday night studies, this is part of what's involved in hermeneutics. You look at a concept, but you look for evidence of that concept. Look at Jeremiah 49 and verse 36. Against Elam I will bring four winds. So here is the winds of God coming against Elam. It's an upheaval of the nations. It's an upheaval. God stirs. Let's get one more and then let's draw a conclusion. Jeremiah 51 and in verse 1. Thus says the Lord, behold, I will raise up against Babylon, against those who dwell, a destroying wind. God's going to bring a wind against Babylon. Jeremiah 50, 51, that is chapters 50 and 51 deal with the fall of Babylon. So we haven't got past verse 3. But if we stopped at the end of verse 3 and got the concept that's being driven, I think we understand something here. And I want you to tell me what that is. But let's go back over what we just saw. If the Great Sea represents the mass of humanity, and the winds represent God stirring that, and out of that comes various governments, one government and then another government, or one kingdom and then another kingdom, what does that tell me? God rules in the kingdoms of men. Absolutely. That's the point of the book. That didn't say that in those words. Daniel's already told us that time and again. He's just given us an illustration that God stirs the sea, and out of it comes various kingdoms. Could God still stir the sea? If he can't, then he doesn't rule in the kingdoms of men. That was only true in Daniel's day. So God no longer is in control. I still believe God's in control. Dennis? All right, absolutely. He rules in the nations and the kingdoms that rule across the earth. Now, any questions on that before we get to the vision itself? All right, let's go through verse 8. Let's get the vision. What was the vision that he saw? Out of the sea grew, come up out of that now, were four beasts. All right. The first, he said each was different from the other. The first was like a lion, and its wings were plucked off. We'll come back to that. The second was like a bear, and he was raised up on one side and had 3 ribs in his mouth and between his teeth, and they said to him, "Arise, devour, and eat much flesh." And then he looked, and there was a third, and it was like a leopard. It had 4 wings and had 4 heads, and had dominion was given to it. And then he said, "I saw a fourth beast," and it was compared to... It wasn't, was it? It wasn't compared to anything. It just said this was a beast. Well, how is it described then? Yeah, it was a terrible, dreadful and terrible and exceedingly strong. It had iron teeth, and it trampled the others, and it had 10 horns. And I was considering the horns, and there was one that grew out amongst them. And look at verse 8. And there was a horn that had eyes of a man and a mouth speaking pompous words. Now, let's get ahead of ourselves. Where are we going to find in this chapter the key that unlocks what this is all about? If all that we had was verses 1 to 8, we would still be left wondering, what on earth do these 4 beasts represent? All right, verse 17 says, and if you don't have this mark this, mark out to the side. This is the key for future study. When you say, I'm wondering, or somebody asks you, what's this all about? Here's the key. The great beasts which are 4 are 4 kings which arise out of the earth. They arise out of the earth. They rose out of the sea is where they arose. In verse 3, out of the mass of humanity. There's part of my understanding of why the sea represents the mass of humanity. And then we'll come back to verse 18 about because we haven't got to that in the vision yet. All right, so let's go back to these 4 beasts just for a moment. So the 4 beasts represents 4 kingdoms. So let's get ahead of ourselves. This is going to be parallel to Daniel 2. Do you remember in Daniel 2, there was this image that Nebuchadnezzar saw, and as it was interpreted, the head of gold represented Babylon, the silver represented the Medo-Persian Empire, the next kingdom, and the brass represented the Greek Empire, and then the iron was the 4th world empire, which was the Roman Empire. This is parallel. This is talking about the same kind of theme. There was something else not mentioned on the screen here in Daniel 2. What happened in Daniel 2? There was really the focal point. Absolutely. Is that mentioned in Daniel 7? Say again. Verse 18, absolutely. Parallel. This is exactly, so you say, I'm kind of confused. I don't know what Daniel 7 is about. If you understand Daniel 2, you can understand Daniel 7. It's talking about the same thing. It's very parallel. And so we have a lion, which represented the first kingdom, mentioned here, which would be Babylon. The bear would represent the Medo-Persian Empire, the leopard, the Greek Empire, and the fourth, the dreadful kingdom, powerful kingdom, would represent the Roman Empire. So let's go back through those just quickly to get some of the perspective of that. Notice back at verse 4, he had wings that were plucked off and as he lifted up from the earth. Nebuchadnezzar, when he took power, began to expand, and as he expanded and got more power that God allowed him to have, he also lost power in the process of becoming so large. Perhaps that's what that's talking about. But I'm more interested in the Medo-Persian Empire. What would be the significance of like this bear who raises up on one side? The Medo-Persian Empire are actually two empires that merged. Say what? They combined to make one, but one of those was more predominant than the other, was it not? The Persians were more dominant. So perhaps this idea of raising up on one side would be that here's the Medo-Persians, that in one side, that is, one part of that is more predominant than the other. Now the Greek Empire was, which is in verse 6, was like a leopard, had 4 wings of a bird. What does that represent? I don't know. Some have suggested that that may refer to the speed with which Alexander the Great conquered the earth. He basically conquered and made a worldwide empire and conquered the earth basically in his mind and was dead by the age of 33. Pretty quick accomplishment. More about him a little bit later. Then the Roman Empire was powerful and strong and dreadful, having the 10 horns, which represented 10 kings. Some suggest that may be literal kings, but it may suggest the idea of complete power. And I'm not going to be dogmatic about that. You can't be dogmatic when it comes to apocalyptic kind of literature. But let's go to at the end of verse 8 before we go to the next part of the vision. They were speaking pompous words. There was this little horn speaking pompous words. What is the little horn? I'm not sure. That may have reference to the Roman emperors, or it may just allude to their persecuting power. But you remember under Rome, what did the Roman emperors demand? Worship. You had to cry, Caesar is Lord, or be burned at the stake. Remember that? We see that in Revelation, for example. That may be the idea of speaking pompous words, that the Roman emperors spoke pompous words. They claimed to be Lord. They claimed to be ruler, the God himself. 4 world empires are dealt with here in this context. Let's go back now. Let's go to the Ancient of Days. Let's start at verse 9. What do you see in this part of the vision? Who is the Ancient of Days? Obviously, God the Father. He's the Ancient of Days. All right? He's pictured here, robed in garments as snow, suggesting perhaps maybe purity. Notice the throne was a fiery flame, its wheels a burning fire. Some suggested the wheels of his throne suggest universality of his rule. So his throne has wheels. Nebuchadnezzar's didn't have wheels, nor did Alexander the Great, nor did any other ruler. But God has wheels on his throne, which probably suggests to us superiority. But as it's worded in Daniel, God rules in the kingdoms of men. There's our theme. What do you see at verse 10 and 11? We saw these kingdoms rise up, but then he looked to the throne of God, and God is sitting on his throne, but this throne is being used for what? Judgment. Here's judgment. God judges the nations. And he saw them come before him. They stood before him, and the court was seated, and the books were open, and he watched because of the sound of the pompous words which were being spoken, and I watched till the beast was slain. So what does that tell us? The Ancient of Days is in control of these nations, and finally brings these nations down. Therefore, we know God rules the kingdoms of men. Makes sense? We don't just look for the phrase, we look for the concept. And we see the concept here. But there's something else happened with the Ancient of Days. By the way, let's get verse 12. We've got to talk about this. They were given dominion. The beast were given dominion for a season and a time. You're going to see this all through Old and New Testament literature. God allows people to have power, but only for a time. And so they were given, they were allotted for a season and a time. In other words, God allowed Babylon, God allowed Greece, God allowed Medo-Persia, God allowed Rome to have power, but only for a time. Which again reminds us, God rules in the kingdoms of men. All right, what else happens? 13 and 14 in this vision. I looked at the Ancient of Days and I saw someone coming to him. He was like the Son of Man. And what happened when he came to the Ancient of Days? He was given dominion, given a kingdom. Interesting point. Look at verse 13. He came to the Ancient of Days to receive his kingdom. He didn't come from the Ancient of Days. Premillennialism says he comes from heaven to receive his kingdom on earth. He received his kingdom when he went to the Ancient of Days, when he ascended. It harmonizes with Acts 1 and Ephesians 1 as well. Now, the territory of his kingdom is all people and nations, verse 14. What about the time of his kingdom? How long will it last? Verse 14. It never ends. Unlike these kingdoms that we see in the four beasts, they come to an end. It's for a time and for a season. Not this kingdom. It's not for a time and a season. It's for forever. It endures forever. All right. I know that's a hurried look at that, but let's begin at verse 15. Now, here's the interpretation of the dream. We've already got ahead and took a sneak peek at verse 17. But verse 17 says, here's the point. This is the four kingdoms. We've already interpreted that and or looked at the interpretation. So let's jump on to verse 18. What do we see from verse 18? That the saints of the Most High should receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, even forever and ever. Say again? Yeah, he wanted to know more about that. Daniel wanted to know more about this fourth beast. And so at verse 14, he asked about the fourth beast. But here's the conclusion that's driven. And so if you want to know what the chapter's about, look at verse 17. There are four kingdoms coming. They're going to fall. There's going to be another kingdom that won't fall. That fourth beast fights against that kingdom. And this kingdom hadn't even come yet. That's the Roman Empire. So let's get a sneak preview of the forecast of what's going to happen. Is the fourth kingdom going to be successful? No. Because God rules in the kingdoms of men. All right. So he said, I want to know more about the fourth beast. So look at verses 19 to 25, where I want to get this gist of this. That he, look at verse 23. The fourth beast was the fourth kingdom on earth. It's different from the others. It shall devour the whole earth and trample. The 10 horns are the 10 kings. It may be, and so what does that represent? The 10 horns, the 10 kings, is it literally 10 kings? Could be. Or could it be 10 in the sense of fullness of power, the persecuting power of the Roman Empire? I'll leave it at that for you to judge. And I don't know that it makes a difference in our interpretation of that. They're going to arise, and they're going to speak pompous words, verse 25. Now let's get to the end of verse 25. They're going to do that for a time, times, and a half a time. Now on Wednesday night we're going to get into, in our hermeneutics class, we're going to get into numbers, the significance of numbers. For example, the number 7 we generally recognize as representing completion. The number 1 would be a unity number. The number 3 being a divine number, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And there's significance of other numbers, but this is time 1 times adding 2, that makes 3 and a half a time, 3 and a half. 3 and a half is half of 7, which seems to indicate incompletion. Haley has emphasized time and again in all of his literature and I've sat at his feet as he talked about that, and it makes sense. That every time that's used, it makes sense in the context that it's incomplete. It's an incomplete period of time. It doesn't represent literally 3.5, as much as a 7 may represent completion. 3.5 is a broken 7. It's an incomplete. And so what's the idea? That Rome is going to have persecuting power, but it's not going to be allowed to go on forever. Does that make sense? It's going to last for a time, times and a half a time. God may have this kingdom set, the one we're in. I'm not talking about the kingdom of God. I'm talking about the United States. May just last for a time, times and a half a time. God's not going to let it have power forever. You see that in chapter 12 and verse 7 of Daniel, and also in Revelation chapter 12 and in verse 14. All right, let's finish the chapter here. The power was given for this fourth beast to have rule over the saints, but look at verse 26. What happens to this power of this fourth kingdom? It's going to be taken away. That's going to be taken away, and the kingdom and dominion and greatness of the kingdoms of the whole earth. And so let me just summarize before we get to verse 28. What he's basically saying is God allows the Roman Empire to have power for a time and a half a time. And then God's going to take away that power. And let's go back now to verse 18. So that the saints of God may possess a kingdom. In other words, the idea of the saints of God possessing a kingdom, the kingdom stood and overcame Rome. The Roman Empire looked like it could crush Christianity. It never did. It never did. And so this is the end of the account, and it's greatly troubled me, and I kept the matter to my heart. By the way, this ends the Aramaic section. Remember we talked in a previous study that where the Aramaic section began, back in chapter 2 and in verse 4. That goes all the way through to the end of this chapter, and we're done with Aramaic. Now we go back to Hebrew. You don't notice that in the English text. That's just a bit of trivia for what that may be worth to you. Questions or comments on 7? So what's this vision all about? Basically, they're going to be 4 world empires. God's going to bring them down, and God has His kingdom. And so it's driving home the principle, God rules in the kingdoms of men. Make sense? All right. Let's go to chapter 8. Here is the vision of the ram and the male he-goat. Or the King James calls it a he-goat, the male goat. Male he-goat is the same thing, isn't it? So let's see what we have here in this chapter. You have the vision and then you have the interpretation. And again, unlike other sections of apocalyptic literature, the interpretation is given in the text. And so we pretty much know what this vision is about. All right, let's go to chapter 8, verses 1 to 4. What is the first part of this vision? Let's first of all get a date. This takes place when? 547, 2 years after the vision before. That was 549, this is 547. Remember, BC dates go backwards. So this is 547 BC. This is still before chapter 5. The events of chapter 5. All right. He saw a vision while he was in the palace. Remember, he was pretty much a minister to the palace. And what he saw was a ram. And what about this ram? It had what? 2 horns. Standing in front of a canal, absolutely. What about the 2 horns? Yeah, one stood up longer and higher than the other. And he was pushing westward and northward and southward. In other words, he was conquering, and it looked like no one could conquer him and deal with him. And then he saw, verse 5, something else happened. Yeah, male goat coming out of the west. What was he able to do? Yeah, he broke the 2 horns, and he could confront the ram, and he moved with rage against him, verse 7, and attacked the ram, broke the 2 horns, and the male goat grew and became great and became strong, and the large horn was broken, and out of its place 4 notable ones came up toward the 4 winds of heaven. And so that's verses 1 through 8. Now let's get 9 to 14 quickly to get this. What happens now with this little horn? Out of them came this little horn. It became great, exalted it himself as the prince of the host, took away the daily sacrifices, and the place of the sanctuary was cast down. What else did he do? He opposed the daily sacrifices, verse 12. And so then I heard a voice saying, how long is this going to go on? And the answer was, verse 14. All right, 2,300 evenings and mornings. Now you may be reading from the New King James, which I am, and it says days. But look at your footnote. What Tom just read, which version are you reading from, Tom? New American Standard. Is a more accurate rendering of that. It was 2,300 evenings, mornings and evenings, or evenings and mornings. So that, don't let that confuse you. Because there's enough other stuff to confuse you. You just don't need that. So what's that about? The simple answer is, I'm not sure. The question is, and I'll refer you to King. King, I have a footnote in, if you've got my work on the major prophets, there's a footnote there, but I reference King. King observes that the intention of the vision is to have the reader to understand that the period of cessation of the continual burnt offering was approximately 3 years and 55 days. Now, how do you arrive at that? The question among students is this 2,300 days, or is it 2,300 sacrifices? Evening, counting evening and morning, making it 1,150 days. So is it 6 years, 6 years and some change, or is it 3 years and some change? I don't know. I'm not sure. Is it figurative, or is it supposed to be literal? I believe it's Kyle and Datelitz spends 7 pages arguing for the fact that this has to be a literal period, and tries to fit it in literally into the time period of Antiochus Epiphanes. And we'll talk about him in just a second as time permits. The point of it is that there's going to be this corruption for a time. Now we'll get to the interpretation. That's going to make sense if you're lost on that. So let's get ahead of ourselves to the interpretation. What's this all about? We have this ram that has 2 horns, one bigger than the other, and then here's this male goat with 1 horn comes and breaks the 2 horns off. He becomes great, and then that horn is broken, and he then has 4 horns comes out of that, and then there's this little horn, etc. What on earth is all of this about? Well, let's start with this. This, whatever he's talking about, is going to be after the Babylonian captivity. You say, how do you know? Let's look at verse 17. He said that he was wondering about this, and a voice said, make this man understand the vision. There's a heavenly being tells him, make this man understand the vision. So verse 17 and 19 are going to be key. Let's get them. So I came near and stood, and when he came, I was afraid and fell on my face. And he said to me, understand, Son of man, that the vision refers to the time of the end. Now read that carefully. It didn't say the end of time, the time of the end. Now let's drop down to verse 19. And he said, look, I'm making you know what shall happen in the latter time of the indignation. There's a key. For the appointed time, the end shall be. I think he's pointing to the end of the indignation. What I'm talking about, what this vision was all about, is something that takes place after the Babylonian captivity. That's what they're in right now. Here's going to be the time of the end, the appointed time of God for the completion of the end of the vision. That it's going to be at the latter time of the indignation, the appointed time of the end. Now that's going to harmonize with what we're going to see beginning at verse 20. Now let me get ahead of myself to say that verse 20 and 21 make a very similar point. How do I know? Well, here's one of our keys. Look at verse 20. The ram, which had 2 horns, are the kings of Media and Persia. So why would there be one horn bigger than the other? Yeah, they were predominant over the Medes. So that makes sense. So I know what that ram represents. Now look at verse 21. The male goat is the kingdom of Greece. So let's get ahead of ourselves here. And let's go back to this slide and let's add some more information here. We had Daniel 2, we had the four world empires. Daniel 7, the four world empires. But Daniel 8 focuses on two of those. And that is the Medo-Persian and the Greek Empire. The ram is the same as the bear and the same as the silver. The male goat is the same as the leopard and the brass. It represented those two kingdoms. He's only focusing on two. And so here is the vision of what's going to take place after this, the time of the end. After Babylonian captivity is going to come two more. Now, he gives us some details about that. Now look at verse 22. As for the broken horn, there are four that came out of its place. Well, the broken horn represents the large eyes of the horn between the eyes is the first king. Well, that's Alexander the Great that had conquered the world by the age of 33. We talked about. There were four sub-empires that came out of that, such as Egypt and Syria and Macedonia and Thrace came out of that. But in interest of time, notice at look at verse 23, 24, and 25. Perhaps it's talking about Antiochus Epiphanes, who was a ruler of the Greek Empire, a ruler during the Greek Empire from 175 to 163. He offered swine on the altar, encouraged fornication in the temple. He forbid sacrifices in the law. And so why was all that going on? Because of the corruption that had been prophesied that takes place. But I'm more interested in this. Look at verse 26. The vision of the evenings and the mornings, which were told is true, therefore seal up the vision, for it refers to many days in the future. He calls it the time of the end earlier, but many days in the future. What he's saying is this vision all concerned the Medo-Persian Empire and the Greek Empire. And what's going to take place during the Greek Empire? There's going to be a bust up of that empire. There's going to be four empires come out of that in the middle of all of that. And then there's going to be this utter corruption, which history says took place with Antiochus Epiphanes. And for lack of better expression, that reminds us that God rules in the kingdoms of men. Does that make sense? Now let's get quickly Daniel's reaction. What was his reaction? Verse 27. Our time is gone. I would be too with that vision. He was exhausted. He fainted, and he said he was sick for days. And afterward I arose and I was astonished by the vision, but no one understood it. In other words, it was not understood until it finally comes to being. And we have the advantage of history looking back. Oh yeah, I see what that's about. And so it's all driving at the point, these visions. You say, what was the whole purpose? To remind Daniel and those who read Daniel, God rules in the kingdoms of men. Make sense? So guess what chapter 9 is going to tell us? When we get through with the 70 weeks, God rules in the kingdoms of men. Yeah, pretty good guess. That's the point we're going to learn. All right, we're going to stop at that right there. Our time is gone.